fuck I mean. Yeah. Yo.
For as long as I've been covering underground rap music, well over a decade now, there's been a void in my coverage. One that if you know the scene well enough, you're probably wondering why I've generally stayed a half step away. Not that I've been open about any dislike of the sound, but I've actually never reviewed a full album of his, which is why he's been absent for any of my year-end list for well over a decade. And my general excuse as to why has been, well, maybe not as clear as it should have been, especially as once you become familiar with his style and cadence, he really should have been up my alley, or at least worth more consideration given all the critical acclaim thrown in his general direction by a set of avid fans and legit hip-hop heads. But I happen to think it's a thornier conversation, and one where perhaps I have not done my due diligence in the analysis, or at least explaining my general, somewhat complicated feelings. It's not a review. It's not some grand treatise. I'm not even sure I'd call this a video essay so much as a scattered, long-form contemplation. Old fingerprints on the handrail of a walk-up that's seen many shoes and boots leaving a lot of their marks in the snow. A rapper whose measured pace is countered by his bountiful release schedule, where there are few who can paint a scene as starkly as he can, but beneath those vivid colors, what can be gleaned? What stories are actually being told? Is there more behind the scenes? But again, this is not a review. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is the Paintings of Roc Marciano. I shouldn't have to introduce you to Roc Marciano at this point, especially if you know hip-hop at all in the past 15 years, especially the underground. Even if you're just a mainstream fan, you may not have heard a verse, but you've heard him by reputation or quotable on social media. A New York MC and producer, stridently devoted to an old-fashioned 90s texture in his sample and mixes, most notably using a lot of old-fashioned equipment, but drums more for texture than booming or driving the groove, which allows Roc Marciano's bars and flow to carry more of the percussive punch, draw more emphasis to what he's saying, a flow that could either be described as painstakingly methodical or slow, monotone, drenched in mafioso storytelling and understated menace. His first guest appearances date back as far as the late 90s, thanks to his work in a crew around Busta Rhymes, but by the early 2010s, he was starting to chart his own path. And it began in earnest.
Get your shit together, brother.
Gangsta Mac. Mars. Too cold, baby, too cold. You killing them, nigga. Yeah.
And the picture, at first, seems familiar. You've heard this brand and balance of coke rap and flexing before, really for decades now. But if there's something that Roc Marciano immediately brings to the table, it's this low-key sneer across a good flow and pretty solid rhymes. A scene painted with old-fashioned New York opulence and some creatively violent methods in order to bring down his enemies. The hooks are minimal. They're clearly not the focus. Between that, a few melodic choices that are awkwardly trying to split the difference between some of the dated electronics of the late 2000s, or just aren't as slick as they could be, or they just don't work at all, getting outshone by both Ka and Sean Price in terms of wordplay or flair, running a little bit longer than it needs, and yeah, some of the garden variety homophobia. It certainly feels like a throwback debut, outlining a formula that's probably going to be refined later. But look, the appeal is obvious. I get why folks call this a classic. If there's a word that characterizes Roc Marciano, it is real, transplanted from a violent era where he'll flex to assert his dominance, but he doesn't have to overplay his hand. The understated tension is doing a lot of work in order to convince that audience he is legit, where he clearly has the imagination to find every way to remove any obstacle in his path, often with some gory results. But amidst all the grisly scowling, I was looking for what made Roc Marciano more than just sitting in the shadow of a Raekwon or Ghostface Killah, and thus the haunted thug's prayer offered a glimpse of the vivid bulldog-eat-dog world that would shape a man to be like this, or how Jungle Fever uses an interracial relationship as a metaphor for dealing coke, with enough detail painting this fatal attraction. But some of it at the time was a little novelty. After a decade of New York City gangsta flexing, living in the aftermath of P. Diddy's shiny suits and Jay-Z playing to the biggest possible commercial stage, there was something to Roc Marciano delivering a texture that felt so visceral and coded as street level, grounded in the grimiest corners but with a taste and hunger to shoot for higher. The origin story is cast. The style is there to set up Roc Marciano's ascent, where there are traces of depth behind that grim portrait, but for now, the stage is set with a lot of dusty but bolder strokes. So what's the next layer in that painting? Reloaded in 2012 feels like the natural follow-through, the amplification of Marsberg. Bigger name producers backing up to craft that texture of elevated blaxploitation alongside the keening melodies and the muffled drums. A few whom Roc Marciano would work with a lot over the next several years. But again, the formula is familiar. Solid as hell multisyllabic flows, grimy street-level hustling and threats, drenched in iconography that feels indebted to decades of New York City opulence and cool, but now with a slightly more contemporary gloss. Success now appears to have been found, but he still has to get his hands dirty, where that tension still pulses beneath the plain-spoken promises, where you can tell some of that creatively graphic violence is coming less out of necessity or a deep-seated longing to get out of the streets, but because he's gonna enjoy the artistry of it all. A lot more on that later. If there's something that stands out most starkly in the progression to Reloaded, it's that Roc Marciano knows anyone can make a kill, and that security in his line of work is at best an illusion, but a creative kill, that can build reputation. Cast a sharper juxtaposition around the lush hedonism in which he flexes. It's why when he mentions crying when Marvin Gaye died on Peru, game respects game, it's also worthwhile to highlight what Roc Marciano did that differentiated him from a lot of his peers in and around that upcoming scene. Marsberg's breakout underground success did not happen in a vacuum, and he would recognize that, especially in New York City, where Action Bronson's exaggerated, borderline outlandish humor could make him a little difficult to take seriously, and LP's thorny darkness from a decade's past would be amplified in a few years later, with bruising presence coming alongside Down South. But on the other side, you had Ka's spiritual introspection, where every line felt very deliberate and layered. You were always looking for that next meaning, alongside the early breakthrough of Billy Woods and his apocalyptic politic, or Uncommon NASA's tangled abstraction. Roc Marciano seemed to split the difference between those worlds, where the low-key humor and less high-minded gangsta stakes, they were balanced out by an impressive control of atmosphere, even if, again, kind of runs too long, and the gender dynamics are woefully dated, and the homophobia has aged even worse, and you start even wondering when Roc Marciano might add that next dimension to a lot of his storytelling and flexing. The painting has picked up a little bit more gloss, the power fantasy is more vividly painted. I get the emotional appeal, but I'm eventually going to start asking if there's anything more beneath it. That next dimension to the scene. So 2013 saw two projects, the mixtape The Pimpire Strikes Back and the album Merci Beaucoup. It's the first but not the last year where Roc Marciano would deliver multiple albums in a year, which as a critic would make following him an increasingly exhausting ordeal. More on that in a bit. But neither of these projects have been the most critically acclaimed in his catalog, and it's worth examining as to why. The mixtape dropped in October and feels, for lack lack of better words, a lot more loose and playful. The heady rush of success and fly flexing balanced out with brighter production, dabbling in a lot of chipmunk soul, where the threats are still there, but the tension's a little muted. A victory lap that shows Roc Marciano can handle a shift in tone and paint a brighter picture. No less a power fantasy, but one that feels more potentially approachable, where after the gangsta does his dirty work, he takes his girl out for lunch and then tips lavishly before going shopping or going to the game. Ergo, it should be no surprise Action Bronson will show up a couple of times. Truthfully, I think Roc Marciano kinda needed this mixtape. I like that he's showing at least another angle to a lot of his storytelling, even if it is just another side of a very familiar coin. But it's Merci Beaucoup that dropped a few months later, December 2013, where some of those questions, they started to ring a little bit louder. If you wanted to draw attention to how you sound different within a sound that you helped repopularize, define your own lane, it makes sense as to why nearly every song here has a guest feature. But that can be a double-edged sword. If said rappers wind up replicating your formula on your production and potentially doing it with more vocal flair or memorable lines. There's also a larger conversation about how 2013 in particular was a year where both mainstream and underground rappers tried to find the most outrageous possible bars that they could get away with and just went there. And Merci Beaucoup, kind of shockingly, is no exception to this. At this point, it's easily Roc Marciano's most inconsistent project, especially with some of the beat choices midway through sounding, well, a little questionable. There's always been extravagant, colorful bragging and wordplay from Roc Marciano, but that line between cool and okay, I'm not even sure you can make this work, it got a lot shakier this time around. And if you're listening and wondering, okay, where is all this going? You've got a good formula, but we can hear the limitations. What's coming next?
Yeah. I want revenge. Yeah. I want revenge.
If you look at Roc Marciano's 2010s, it's hard not to notice that 3-year gap. It's tough to measure momentum in the underground, but not influence. And coming out of the early 2010s, Roc Marciano had resurrected a template and painted one hell of a picture, so it's kind of interesting that in the mid-2010s, for such a prolific artist both before and especially after, those years appear quiet, relatively speaking. It wasn't like he dropped off the face of the planet or anything. He put out plenty of guest verses between 2014 and 2016, but maybe he had to take stock of the situation, recognizing the formula had reached an early ceiling. It needed to be fine-tuned. It's also worth highlighting that in the advent of streaming, this was a time when his business might need to recalibrate, reset a lot of his commercial enterprise so that a rapper of such opulent taste could actually bring in the money and back it up. Now, from this point onwards, his solo projects would be released under his own independent record label, Marci Enterprises, and while there are plenty of acts that would flood the market in the streaming scene and this era, I've got a little bit more respect for an artist who will make more money directly hand over fist doing it. So if it took him a little bit of time to untangle previous business arrangements with other labels in the mid-2010s, keeping his name out there while laying all the foundation, maybe recording a ton of music early to be ready to go, because again, he is a credible producer in his own right, it shouldn't be surprising that he was ready in a big way in 2017 with Rosebudd's Revenge. The threats are there. The extravagance is here. The production palette is again familiar, and thankfully away from any of the questionable leftovers of the early 2010s, but the energy, it's a little different this time. The first line that leapt off the page for me was on the title track, early on, "My taste buds trump your flavor of the month." If anything, it speaks to Roc Marciano's ethos, adds another layer to the painting, not just the delicate balance between mafioso flexing and that nastier clear undercurrent of what will happen if you cross him, but a higher purpose in showcasing that taste and a lot of its power. To answer the question of why he's doing all of this beyond the easiest, "it's what I do," which would cut off any deeper conversation. Here it's meta-commentary. Bars that are deliberately commenting on the artistry itself, where the historical weight becomes its own self-affirming justification, where it can feel both therapeutic, but also kind of fun. Proven to work. If not, he'll just go back to what he was doing before. That works too. Even if a song like Pray For Me follows in the line of the Thug's prayers that could highlight the trauma that it could well inflict upon him again. What's interesting here is that the Roc Marciano fans that weren't simply overjoyed by his return saw the slightest division here. When you've got two early albums considered classics that are so laser focused on what they do with such pointed detail, some will see the adding of any questions of that formula will be rendering your central idea more diffuse and scattershot. But I also think it runs a little bit deeper here. I talked a lot about New York cool in my recent commentary on A$AP Rocky, and Roc Marciano almost feels like the mirror image. Of course, A$AP Rocky's considerably younger and does not have Roc Marciano's long pedigree in underground hip-hop, but think of what they actually have in common. Both are New York City MCs, where their sense of cool is derived from something that ultimately swings around to make sense in New York, but feels a bit displaced. For Rocky, it's displaced in location, a sound and stylism borrowed from the South. From Roc Marciano, it's almost displaced in time, where eventually his throwback would become influential and not really a throwback anymore. Both men balance a fashion-conscious swagger with a certain tangible menace. Both are at their absolute best building this lush sense of atmosphere in both production and wordplay, where it might challenge the aesthetic status quo before becoming just a norm in their own space, and both are critically beloved by rap nerds for fundamentally the same reason, in the creation of that machismo, that power fantasy. And from both men, I've wound up questioning where that next layer of depth ultimately is, whether they've simply found their comfort zone to wring as much cash out of the system and scene and audience as possible. And this is where there is a very noted divergence, because Roc Marciano seems very much aware that the majority of his music is built to function strongest in community, away from the larger music industry. The layered blaxploitation references in the vocal snippets and content, the long historical lineage of his samples, and the rappers who helped shape his sound, building that black, independent, small business. And with that, I'm Not a Hipster line on Burkina Faso on Rosebudd's Revenge, a tacit acknowledgement of the recognition of power within his space. It's gonna matter more than chasing that largest commercial audience. Well, if A$AP Rocky is the hip-hop gatekeeper's second worst nightmare, behind Post Malone, Roc Marciano is the gatekeeper's champion, where if broader cultural acceptance reemerges, it will fundamentally be on Roc Marciano's own terms. It already has been. Which is why the meta-commentary matters to me, and it's why Marksman with Ka, focusing so tightly on musical craft, is my personal favorite on that great album. It deepens the arc of why he does what he does. Helps you connect with the artist even more. But it's also why the 2018 sequel to Rosebudd's Revenge, The Bitter Dose, and then Behold a Dark Horse later in the year, kind of wound up more disappointing than I expected, because it felt like Roc Marciano was swinging back after even a trace of deeper introspection to refortify his lane and his turf. The formula is, of course, here, but it feels like more of a wallow. The production is seedier and more brittle, where the half-sung hooks are pretty weak, and some of the lines show an MC slipping back into bad habits, where amidst all the flexing, the balance between I'm taking this deadly seriously and you should as well, it's self-aware commentary on his world and what one might need to do to survive, and or let's say always strive and prosper, and then, okay, I'm totally taking the piss. That balance is more tenuous than ever. And speaking of piss, it's reminiscent of that yellow diamonds that look like pee-pee line from Clips' Let God Sort Him Out from last year. It's a gross lyric. But I dislike what it represents even more. That when you put artists on a pedestal, they start getting passes for what would never be tolerated from those without that position. It feels like resting on your laurels, hard power claimed via birthright and threats, where if the craft was better, you wouldn't have to do it. And I know it looks away me bringing this up, especially perceived as potentially outside of a smaller, more localized community, where power and wealth is hard to come by, and you fight all the harder to preserve it. And even if it requires you to look past the missteps, because he at least has that power. And let's not act like those missteps don't exist across the catalog. The homophobia has diminished over time, but it still was kind of there, jumped out at the worst possible moments, as is the boilerplate misogyny and machismo. To say nothing of all the dated pimp archetype that, let's not mince words here, glamorizes sexual abuse. And Roc Marciano does not spare a lot of details. And yeah, I know he's playing the noir anti-hero, that at the album's best it's grounded in a historical black struggle where the hustlers and dealers and pimps were the ones that could support the black communities amid systemic racism across the era, going back decades. But it's also a power fantasy, and by extension power structure, that Roc Marciano is more interested in maintaining than deconstructing. Skipping forward to 2019's Marciology, Choose and Fees extends its lecture of game as a pimp to the audience, sticking with his formula and a hierarchy as the natural, smart decision, which of course naturally puts him on top. And when you get to Joe Jackson and the mentions of being a bad dad, even if in passing, where he couldn't discipline his kids because he was dealing with other shit, it either reads as this choked, self-aware glimpse into a more real systemic consequence of the lifestyle, or extending the metaphor throughout the rest of the song, where he's contemptuous of those who have copied a lot of his mold but don't get it. A jab at those who hopped in his lane now that it's considered popular, while he considers few good or real enough to ride in that lane. Given the Prodigy and Max B samples that bookend Marciology about the saturated scene with too many rappers taking away from the select few who deserve more because they're that good. Oh look, there's a part of me that just wants to juxtapose this entire video with Innuendo Studios' old video, There's Always a Bigger Fish. It's uncannily revealing. If you want to pause and check that video out now, I would highly recommend it. Really puts a lot of the past decade of politics in a lot of context. And if you come back steaming mad that I just did that, you should probably keep watching. I'm going somewhere. Because I'm also not saying Roc Marciano is remotely unique in this, or deserves blame. As a country music and metal fan who likes pulp fantasy and exploitation movies, I, and indeed any audience, is not blameless here. Systemic critique is not a call-out, it's not canceling. It's an ask to dig deeper, acknowledge why we like certain tropes or archetypes, why they have power, why they persist. Maybe we might learn something about them or ourselves along the way, make better or more interesting art as a result. With The Bitter Dose, and by extension, Behold the Dark Horse and Marciology, if I was going to be charitable, albums like those represent someone who holds to his principles at all cost. Sees the encroachment of an even worse class of MC, characters that have no code at all. To quote Diamond Cutters, if violence hurts how we eat and it defeats the purpose. But from Tom Chambers, only a fool would assume that those thugs would adjust to the rules. So the justice must be justified. And even if you think his code deserves scrutiny, at least he has one. At least he's making the time to go to church, drop the thug's prayer. But the code in service of what exactly? On Samson and Delilah and Behold the Dark Horse, he claims he speaks for the voiceless, the dudes like him who are not afforded the platform. But by the late 2010s, there were plenty of acolytes of his sound and influence. The ideals behind it were not so uncommon amidst any given old head holding court at the barbershop or any given podcast. And when you've heard the same story over and over again, the same decade plus, what more needs to be said if you aren't going deeper? I'd certainly say there's more than just the worship of money, as some critics asserted about Behold the Dark Horse, because on Marciology, on In God We Trust, he spits directly in the face of that. They wrote the codes they follow. It's more than just cash rules. You should know that if you're paying attention. And while the scenes and crimes that shaped his world are bleak, might as well cop the Patek because time's precious. Enjoy the fruits of one's legacy while he's still alive. Does that have a deeper message? A deeper meaning worth exploring?
Oh yeah, 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 oh yeah,
100 Black Marci.
oh yeah,
Yo, it's the
As the 2010s slipped into the 2020s, I found myself paying most attention when Roc Marciano varied his formula. So while Mount Marci is a pretty solid COVID-era project in 2020, firmly in his comfort zone, but with some weathered and intriguing samples and wordplay that was no less flavorful, although the first time I would describe specific references of his to being of their time, which was a little incongruous with his sound, I did notice the homophobia had largely been excised. In an era where he could have very easily taken the reactionary push double down against critique, Roc Marciano deserves real credit for sidestepping that entirely. It's very interesting that Roc Marciano, despite playing to a very old, dark archetype with all manner of dated anachronisms, found at least a small space there to modernize. And following after his semi-direct response to critics on records before, I would not be surprised if he saw everything that was read or said about him, which is also something I've been keeping acutely in mind when assembling this video. And it certainly makes the writing process kind of interesting. Sup if you're watching. And while I am probably not the best person to talk about his 2 full-length collabs with Alchemist, Roc Marciano is as fly and creatively on point as ever. With his marked contempt for the internet gangstas wearing a cut like Street Magic, he'll throw away any moniker of cool if it comes to being seen in the same room as them. I'm just kind of tired of the buttery, increasingly stale loops from Alchemist production. That's a me thing. I talked about it with Freddie Gibbs before, but 2024's Marciology caught my ear. It seemed to be a point where he was looking to experiment within the darkness in the production, with the creeping minor key pianos, the off-kilter synths, the stalking bass lines, some faster, damn near even contemporary flows, the threats that can feel outright gratuitous in the villainy, the imagery even more creatively vicious and vibrant, where his admittedly weak singing now only seemed to amplify the nonchalance and the violence, waiting in the rafters to strike. The hitman whistling past the graveyard. It was a real high point. It stood out on style alone, and it's where I run into a problem when talking about Roc Marciano, especially in the 2020s, and where I'm not surprised that a lot of critics who are not diehard fans just give up. Market saturation. Between Behold the Dark Horse in 2018 and the newest album that dropped in early January of this year, there are nearly a dozen collab albums, with Roc Marciano rapping or behind the boards as a producer, not counting solo output. They've all gotten a little shorter with time compared to some of the bloat of his early work, but reading reviews of those projects, you come to realize eventually people run out of synonyms to describe his formula so much that he keeps to it. At this point, we all know what Roc Marciano does as a producer and a rapper. There's a built-in community and audience, including a lot of other New York rappers, A-list and below, that won't just praise his work to high heavens, but also buy every high-priced album and merch item he puts out. And you know what? Good for them. I can't front on this. He built a small business on consistency and professionalism, knowing his audience and holding to a code. If he doesn't want to fuck with the formula in an increasingly unstable economic environment, who can blame him? And truthfully, when I look back on my own output as a critic, just to get a little self-referential here myself, where I built a formula, making videos, only subtly tweaking said formula for over a decade for literally thousands of reviews, where your word as bond means more than any given review, as you have to make money hand over fist, because I've never taken a sponsorship deal on either of my channels. I feel it would cheapen what I say, where there are kids who watched my reviews in the 2010s, who are now rediscovering I'm still doing this, or who are making critically acclaimed music now. If there's a kinship I feel with Roc Marciano, it's work ethic, playing the long game, outlasting your competition on consistency alone. Understanding the value of routine, community, quotables, where I think we both made the same mistake in saturating the market, where you might know and appreciate the finer details that come in the craft of everything you do, where folks will hear the difference if they pay close enough attention, and you know that, but more likely you'll wind up caught in the cycle of content, a box that hems you in, especially when you get older, and algorithmic penetration basically becomes a crapshoot.
No, it's mandatory. Fiend come through the crib, nigga, try to cop, nigga. Straight violation. You gotta violate him right at the door. You know what I'm saying? You gotta knock nigga out right at the door. You know what I'm saying? Y'all niggas got horrible taste, nigga. This shit quiet luxury, nigga.
656 is the album I've been waiting for Roc Marciano to make for years. It's legit great. The album art of the decayed floppy disk is not only apropos for reasons we will explore, but also reminded me of Motherboard, a 2016 album from West Coast MC LMNO, who also happened to be self-produced, and another veteran of that scene with very low-key flows, who may have also flooded the market in his time when he put out 10 albums in 2010. The only guest star on this album is Errol Holden, who acquits himself pretty well with the meticulous storytelling that he showed off when Roc Marciano produced an album for him last year. But there's a part of me that really feels the absence of Ka on this thing. Just a year and a half after he sadly passed, because he kind of would have been Roc Marciano's perfect partner on it in content. Rest in power. Listening between the lines, for as much as the braggadocious flair is gonna be remembered, it's so many quotables, you can tell Roc Marciano is a bit self-conscious of what that character would feel as he ages, or his reality closer to home. It's not fully the truth, not a lie either. And he's already tilted a little into the humor, playing to the absurd, but the truth about every comedy that runs long enough is that it either becomes broad farce, or it is forced to develop depth, forces more difficult questions, introspection. And I've been waiting for Roc Marciano to take that step for so long. The production is his usual standby of aged loops and decaying samples, but with hints of chillier electronics. This time they feel even more brittle, even more fragmented, where the soulful analog touches crackle around the edges, and the synthesizers feel constantly on the verge of breaking down, like finding, well, an old boot drive, and hoping against hope that enough of the physical media has held up. A relic of the past, maybe, but that feels like a misdirect. On Childish Things, he wants to shun the back in my day nostalgia when there was so much crap back then. He knows and remembers it. And he's got even less love for the rappers who reference brands, but then sully them by their whack presence. Expensive garments on a cheap bitch. He seeks a more profound beauty, and a comfort than merely the status of a label on a garment. And Rain Dance really crystallized how and why it meant more to him. A certain transcendence of comfort and craft, the finest of details, where the best of taste comes in being able to make that differentiation, notice the difference, but when you get to a certain level, it becomes socially isolating. Especially when you refuse to tolerate low standards, or see those who might mimic the style but miss the subtleties. It drives you nuts. It's a fascinating conversation because being a nerd is often linked to antisocial fixation, where my taste buds trump your flavor of the month rings even sharper, but there is a slight bitterness in realizing that everyone might be at the party where that flavor of the month actually is. You might be the misfit. You might be alone. And yet at a certain point, if you're confident, comfortable in what you've done, if your lane is more introverted and entrenched and you can speak directly to what you know is true, many nerds' greatest want is companionship, acceptance, but their greatest true pleasure comes in the craft of what they know, the special interest. If you're lucky enough to find someone who can find both, it's a pleasure beyond measure. And yet, even on a stacked team, nothing's guaranteed. He's a Knicks fan, I'm a Raptors fan. We're both familiar with that cruel reality. And you know what, speaking of basketball, closing track, I think by mellow, he knows that he's giving jewels to folks who aren't getting it, or who might only get it later, might only appreciate it later, or might never get it. But I like the line, the choices between food and candy. What's the cheap thrill versus what actually sustains you? And on a metatextual level, he knows what sustained him. If you don't get it, It's not for you. He's just fine with that too. I've used the word and symbol of painting with Roc Marciano deliberately, because for the longest time he's felt representative of his work. Art painstakingly crafted and shaped, where texture matters and you can feel every brushstroke, where the artistry evokes a long historical lineage, where color and detail leaps off the canvas, creates a stark, dramatic image frozen in time, and where for the vast majority of those experiencing it, feels two-dimensional. But that's the truth of painting, be it from a fine craftsman in the largest of studios or an amateur hunched in the darkness, is not just what it shows, but what it reflects. And you might not like what you see, or the thoughts it stirs, especially if it rings the body electric. I might not love every brushstroke. I might think there are details and contrast that should be more sharply painted and defined. Not every work will be for me. Not every work will be for indeed everyone. But the art is the medium of conversation. Not every word comes to your fancy or will be understood without time and deeper consideration, especially when the true resonance came for me, not in what the painting is, but in the method of its making, putting in the work, dismantling those who would diminish you. And that, it's not just a painting that Roc Marciano is creating. Behold, instead, a mirror.